May I please have your attention? We are going to start the lunch presentation. As explained earlier, if you thought the morning presentation was helpful with specific tactics and techniques, you will enjoy the lunchtime presentation by New York Counts 2020 about GOTC recommendations and strategies. And to do that presentation, I would like to introduce, if you don't already know her, Mita Anand, who is the Senior Fellow for the New York Immigration Coalition, working on the Census 2020 efforts. She is everywhere. She is reaching all corners of New York City, making sure that not only the members of New York Counts 2020 have the resources and materials they need, but also all of the stakeholders engaged in the 2020 census process. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mita Ahmed. Thank you.
I actually asked Melva to introduce me as Mini Melva, but I failed. I'm also introducing Wenny Chin, who's our Civic Engagement Senior Manager at New York Immigration Coalition. So we are presenting a guide to organizing for the Census 2020, or GOTC for GOTC. Okay, I was really proud of that. Okay, so thank you. But before I start, can we just have a round of applause for how well the day has gone so far? Now you know I want to be called Mini Melva, so that like when we say Melva, that was amazing. Like I just feel like a little mini Melva. Okay, get out the count. The collective direct efforts by institutions and individuals to ensure completion of the Census 2020 for a fair and accurate count of our state. So everyone we've heard from so far has emphasized why this is important. So we've heard that part. We know why we need to do it. So it's the how are we going to do it. So get out the count is about persuasion, mobilization, and follow-up. Another way I like to think about it is you have like two gaps you have to fill here, right? One is your intention to fill out the census? So the first is convincing people that that is what they want to do. There's another gap, which is then they actually have to do it. And in this census, what we've heard are the issues at both levels, right? The intention has been harmed by fear, and the actual ability to do it is somewhat harder because it's going online. So these are the things we're facing with Get Out the Count. How do we address that intention gap? How do we address that action gap? And in order to do that, persuasion, mobilization, and follow-up. The who of GOTC. So hopefully the who of GOTC is not us. We will be doing it, but hopefully we don't need to be persuaded to do it. So just, if you're willing to do this, work with me on this. Who here thinks they filled out the 2010 census? It's not the full room, right? And we have every intent to do it. So think about that, right? So like, now I'm going to assume that everyone in this room and their friends and their family are going to do it this year. So I'm not talking about us here. We're talking about the hard to locate. Those are people who live in illegal basement conversions. These are the homeless. These are highly mobile transient communities. The hard to contact. These are children. These are people who live off the grid. The hard to persuade. So here we're talking about what we've heard. People who distrust the government. We hear people who don't want to be involved, right? And think about some of the comments we heard today about like the LGBTQ community who feel like they've been excluded from the census, and as a form of protest, they don't want to participate. And they're not the only ones, right? There are many questions on the census that people feel don't accurately reflect where we view race these days or ethnicity these days. So there are people who don't want to engage at all. And then we have the hard to interview. And that could be language issues, that could be low literacy, that's lack of access to the internet. These are the things we're facing when we're talking about hard to count. But this is also important to think about. We're saying hard to count because that's the common parlance. That is, at the same time, a hard phrase, right? We're placing the onus. We're saying they are hard to count. These are historically undercounted communities. Let's not shift the blame as to why they are historically undercounted. And also, with these changes that we've all heard about, it's not just the historically undercounted that we're worried about. We're shifting more people into what is an at-risk category. So think of it as people at risk to not be counted. There are risk factors as to why they're not being counted. And we know these risk factors. These are some of them. We've heard them. The New York State Complete Count Commission issued a report on October 8th. It delineated 10 risk factors. Here we have more. New York City has a high percentage of 8 of the 10 risk factors. So like Speaker Corey Johnson said earlier, 40% of New York City residents are foreign born. That is one of the highest risk factors for not completing the census. And I'm sure we can sit here and I bet we could poll the room and come up with other communities that would fall in these categories. It's a lot. So, when is GOTC? Tomorrow? No. Practically, census rollout starts next month. That's why we're having this event today. We are starting the community education and outreach. And like our speaker said this morning about the 7 touches, hearing it 7 times in 30 days to have a 90% chance of doing it. Juan Rosa from NALEO reemphasized that. Esmeralda Simmons often says, it's like water when it first hits parched earth. It doesn't permeate right away, it just rolls off. You have to keep doing it again and again before people understand. And that's why it's so important to start the education and outreach phase now. Then we have the self-response period. Questionnaires are going to start coming through on March 12th, or the forms directing you to go online to fill it out. And then and that runs till the middle of May. And then we have the non-response follow-up period. Speaker Johnson talked a bit about why we're focusing on self-response. And I'm sure Julie Menon, when she comes to speak later, she will talk about that. But it's very simple. 1, that's how you're going to get the most accurate data. 2, we don't have as many resources from the federal government this year. So this is how we're actually going to get at the count. 3, that's where you get the accurate data. You don't want someone knocking on the door, not finding you, and then the neighbor, asking your neighbor how many people live there, and they forget about the baby. And finally, lots of communities, they're scared of that door knock. I'm at the New York Immigration Coalition. We know our communities don't want a door knock from someone from the government right now. So how do you avoid that door knock? You answer it beforehand. So one of the fun things, though, is this is an opportunity to really engage communities and build community. One way to do it is taking advantage of Census Day 2020. That'll be on April 1st. Census Day, I think, confuses people, right? People think, I fill it out on Census Day. That's not what Census Day is, and I hope everyone in this room knows that. Census Day is your reference day. So it's where will you be living, were you living on April 1st, 2020. That being said, it's a big day. What an awesome opportunity to have community events and get people together. So I hope everyone in this room on Census Day will be doing something other than filling out their online questionnaire, because they already will have filled out their online questionnaire. So, due to a remarkable confluence of events, it's on a Wednesday. Now, if anyone here gets my emails, you will know I love Wednesdays, because Wednesday is We Count Wednesday. And on We Count Wednesdays, New York Counts 2020, up until this week, had been mobilizing to tell Governor Cuomo a little bit of why we were unhappy with him. Luckily, this week, he made us less unhappy with him. So we are going to be reshifting what We Count Wednesday is about, and it's now about taking actions. What can you do to get out the count? And we're going to be making sure that we have activities on We Count Wednesdays from now through Census Day. Now, I've done the easy part. Winnie led a series of groups through the past few months to get to the hows of GOTC, and she's going to lead you through that part.
Thank you. Thank you, Mita. So before I go into GOTC, I like to frame it in something that's maybe a little more, something that we do often. So raise your hand if you have ever held a wedding of your own or attended a wedding of someone else's. Cool, awesome. Okay, so we understand the concept of weddings. Number one, weddings are expensive, right? Number two, it involves a lot of people. And remember that process when you had to figure out who's going to your wedding. You send out these save the dates ahead of time. Hey, my wedding is on May 12th. And then you send out the actual invitations. Can you please RSVP to my wedding now? And then you don't hear back from a few of your families, of your friends, of your family's friends. So what do? You have to do a follow-up process. And I like to frame GOTC in this wedding context because everything that you would do to follow up with your family members and friends and those strangers that your mom says you have to invite, we all know those. You use the same methods for GOTC. You can send them an email, send a flyer, and let them know that you're having your wedding. You may have in-person conversations. The next Thanksgiving gathering, you're like, hey, by the way, Uncle Joe, can you fill out my RSVP card? Thanks. Or you might send a text, give them a ring, or you might post on social media. And these are all tools that we can use to really get out the count in our own communities. So imagine, and I take from Steve's earlier point about money, power, and respect. Think about the census as your own little wedding. There's money to be lost because any seat that is not filled is going to cost you money for that empty table. If your wedding doesn't run well, your in-laws are going to think you don't know how to run it, and you're going to lose power bargaining with your in-laws. And all of your guests are going to be like, oh, this is a half-filled wedding, and then you'll lose respect with your community or with your family. So taking in that money, power, respect into our wedding model, really thinking about the implications of what an undercount means for your wedding.
So, hearkening back to our previous point, imagine if your wedding, you could only have people respond to it online. And by the way, that's what I did. It didn't work out. So for the census, one of the ways to solve this gap, and by the way, in New York State, I don't have the number for New York City. If anyone has it, I'd love to hear it. 15% of households do not have broadband. 20% in New York City, thank you, Jillian. So 20% in New York City have either only dial-up or no internet access whatsoever. So that's that action moment again. And one of the ways to address that is digital access points. And we're not going to go heavy into that. New York City Census has a plan for that. I'm not talking about Elizabeth Warren, but yeah. So New York City Census has a plan for that. And Digital Equity Lab has put out an amazing toolkit, which I highly suggest that if anyone's considering going down this route, to do it. And it's not just set it up, it's find a spot where people in your community are congregating already and have that access point set up following the guidelines provided by Digital Equity Lab.
Absolutely, and I actually encourage even if you're not thinking about doing becoming a digital access point, I think anyone who's interested in doing GOTC and interacting with data should read this piece of document, and I really want to give a shout out to the folks at the Digital Equity Lab. I saw Greta, who has worked heavily on this. I'm not sure if she's here. I saw Megan McDermott. Megan, thank you for putting it together. And everyone at the Digital Equity Lab, thank you, thank you.
So how do we do this? This is the real nitty gritty now, right? Like stuff we can do. You're going to have GOTC emails. This falls right in line with what we were hearing earlier this morning from Abney, right? Emails, not necessarily like the snazziest thing going on, but they're effective. Calendar out your emails. Know when you're going to send them. Don't just, wake up Wednesday morning and go, oh God, it's Week Count Wednesday, I need to send an email. Like, be ready for it. Include census pledges in all your mailers. If someone pledges to take the census, they are more likely to take the census. Use hyperlinks in your online emails and share flyers and leaflets in common areas. And that, by the way, is an easy lift. If you are an organization that isn't going to do all the bells and whistles, you can still have flyers in your waiting room saying, this is why it's important to complete the census. You can still have a tent card saying, questions, here's a hotline for questions around the census. These are really important to keep in common areas because of that repetition of message that we've been talking about.
Absolutely, and I just want to also emphasize how important it is that we continue to build visibility around the U.S. Census logos. I think for a lot of communities, actually anyone in general, when you get mail, you look at it and then 95% of the chance it'll end up in your garbage bin within 5 seconds. So really helping our communities understand that if you see communications bearing this logo, don't toss it out. It's important. It's something you should read through and you should follow the instructions on it to fill out your census. So really thinking about the low lifts, the low-hanging fruits, including posters around your community. Maybe if you work with small businesses, asking them if they can share this logo. So if people understand and recognize when people are at their doors that this is something that they need to respond to. And then when we go into the harder conversations of GOTC, I don't think we can depart from canvassing. I think anyone here who's worked on a campaign will understand that door knocking and having that face time with your community is invaluable because that face time humanizes the message. It allows for longer conversations with the community. And I think one great way of thinking about it's very labor intensive, but it's so effective because even when you don't get that face time, you can leave behind literature that's valuable information for your community. But in order to make canvassing work in your community, you have to, one, find the right messengers with the right message. Now, earlier today, we've learned about the right messages, but really recruiting volunteers now, recruiting staff that can really connect to your community, have that language competency to speak to your community, and then setting them up for success. Include in all of your Canvas operations multilingual scripts, using multilingual literature that is effective and can communicate to your community. And I like this a lot, and I don't think people think about wherever you go, regardless of whether you're door knocking or not, you should have a laminated copy of that census questionnaire invitation so that you can refer to it almost immediately. And then my last point is that always know what you can and cannot do at the door. Having time at the door is really powerful, but also recognize that maybe there are things like you shouldn't be helping someone fill out the census at the door because, quite frankly, any employee that's not employed by the U.S. Census Bureau is not protected by Title 13. So that exchange, that interaction that you're having, if you're filling out the census for someone else, you have to be aware that that conversation is not Title 13 proofed. And then I think something that can really help our canvassing operations is to use the U.S. Census Bureau's interactive maps. When the census rolls out, they will have an interactive map that will give you semi-real time. And I say semi because there may be some paper questionnaires. But you can use the real-time maps that will allow you to look at the self-response rate in each census tract. Earlier, someone said, know your census tract, and I think that's really important. I actually don't know it, so I'm gonna go back and look for it. But use census real-time maps to, one, help you gauge how effective has your program been. If you've been door knocking in a specific area and community, you wanna probably go back and look and see if self-response rate has changed. And two, it helps guide your work. It helps you understand where should you be deploying your volunteers in your next GOTC Canvas operation. if this specific community has a 95% self-response rate, and then the neighboring census tract has a 37% self-response rate, maybe you need to reallocate your resources to really focus and target on the communities that are left out. And then lastly, remember that any operation that you do can always be improved with your own data. And I mean taking in really good data management practices by always running cleans on your list to remove out any bad addresses, any other information that you've received. Maybe you want to remove households who've indicated that they have already filled out the census. And then lastly, your data informs your conversations. So if you have had a conversation and they filled out a text pledge 2 months ago, you can refer back to that when you're at the door and be like, hey, we spoke before actually, and this is why I'm here. So really using your own data to create a more impactful operation. And the last point, we've talked about the timeline around GOTC, but I want to highlight this specific point. When you are door knocking, it is important to remember that the U.S. Census Bureau will start their door knocking process. It's called the Non-Response Follow-Up Operation, NRFU, as we call it. And I didn't call it that, okay. And that operation will commence in May 2020. So if your organization or your institution is thinking about, getting volunteers to go out and door knock, remember that the best time to do it is actually before May 2020. Mm-hmm.
I just want to add, we are giving door knocking guidance here because it's important, but it also doesn't mean that every community needs door knocking. Like inherent within this, and as will be emphasized later, it has to be tailored to your community. So if your community is not a community where that would be effective, don't door knock. But if you're in a community where you know that has been effective, then these are the guidelines for it.
Absolutely. And then let's take a step away from door knocking. I think good old phone communications, that phone call to Uncle Joe to see if he's coming out to your wedding. I think it's a great way to reach areas that Mita had earlier identified as hard to locate. You may not be able to knock on every door, but hopefully most people have some type of phone access and you can call them. I also think this is really invaluable because when you work with a diverse community, you can use phone lists to target specific communities by having a phone banker or a caller who can speak a specific language and really run through a list that is specifically people who speak that language. And so it makes targeting much more effective. And then third point is you should always schedule out your phone banks. Sorry. And I think the point that we keep stressing is you can't just give someone a call and assume that they're going to fill out the census, but really layer on your calls. Give them a call maybe in April, give them another call in May to follow up, and make multiple passes of your list. Another good hygiene for phone banking is to use local area codes. I, for one, never answer my phone if it's coming from a number I don't know or if it's not a 718 number. So use local area codes, always have a number to leave behind. Use voicemails as a great way to leave behind a message. Any effort that you're doing, don't walk away from that conversation without leaving behind any message. Whether you're at the door, you should leave a flyer. Whether you're on the phone, you should leave a voicemail. And then here are some really good tools I want to guide you to. I promise this is not product placement. I don't get a cut from them. There's, quote unquote, no quid pro quo. I had to do it. I want nothing from them. But these are... I'm glad you had a good laugh. But these are tried and true tools that we have used in the civic engagement space. I think NGP Van is a platform that we're very familiar with, and if you need guidance, please come speak with me afterwards, and I'm happy to have a conversation on how you can implement these tools and where you can get access to these tools. ThruTalk and Hub Dialer are very well-known predictive dialers. Predictive dialing is a little different model than the normal phone banking that you may be used to. Normally, you have a phone list and you have a volunteer, and you're dialing the numbers one by one to have a conversation. Technology has improved that process so that you're not necessarily dialing one number at a time, but you dial one number, and then that automatic system will help dial 10 numbers and reach and connects you with someone who answers, so that your canvassers or your phone bankers are not spending time going through dial tones or punching in multiple phone numbers time after time. So thinking about how you can make your phone bank more effective, not just having volunteers and doing it the old-fashioned way, but knowing that there are tools out there that can make this a much more large-scale operation. And then the last part that I like to touch on is my favorite part. I tell my mom, don't call me. I don't want to answer your phone. I'm always on the train. So text me. I am a millennial, so I like to text. And I think it's a great way to reach out to people who, quite frankly, when we look at that that at-risk undercounted populations, texting is pretty useful because there is no onus on the other person to receive your communication. They don't have to open a door. They don't have to pick up a phone. They will receive your communications when they look at their phone. So really thinking about how to build in texting into your GOTC operations. And one great way is to launch a text pledge. And I'll walk you through what those pledges look like shortly. With all text bank, it's similar to phone bank. You should use different scripts. Prepare your canvassers with scripts that can respond to difficult questions like, what is the census? Why should I fill out the census? When is the census? Have all of these responses cultivated into your text bank scripts so that your canvassers don't have to be looking for the answers when they're having those exchanges. And then something I really like is take advantage of all your wrong phone numbers. When you call someone, when you're doing like voter engagement, you want to make sure that you're talking to the right person. But when you're doing the census, because everyone gets to participate, even if it's the wrong number, you can still tell them to go out and fill out the census questionnaire. And then the last part that I think that texting can be really, really useful is that you can actually send them the link to the actual census page when that becomes available. So you can tell them, fill out the census here, and then send them the link to the page, and they can do it directly from your text. Some peer-to-peer text tools include ThroughText and Hustle, and I think these are really great ways to get your organization kind of building in texting into your organization if you don't already do it. And earlier I talked about pledges. I think when you do texting, think about it as easy lift for multi-touches. You can send number of text blasts. One, maybe you want to target them with a pledge before the census rolls out. When the census questionnaires hit their mailbox, maybe you want to be like, hey, by the way, it's in your mailbox, and give them a notice. And then you may want to do a reminder follow-up. Be like, by the way, have you filled out your census questionnaire yet? So you're really building on different messages throughout the periods of GOTC with different texting scripts. And then we can also use online and paper pledges. I think pledge cards are something we are familiar with, but there are new tools in which you can text to pledge. Sometimes when we do fundraisers, we see if you text a number and you text them $500, you've donated $500. And I think it's a great way to get people to commit earlier than the census rollout period. Getting someone to pledge and asking them to share their pledge is also a great way to do relational organizing. And then the last piece, social media. Share fun images. I heard someone earlier mentioned memes. My mom likes to send me good morning memes with the glittery flowers. So maybe during census period, I'll send her that same glittery flower and say, take your census questionnaire. And also use different platforms that reach your community. We know the Facebook, we know the Snapchat and Instagram, but there are also communities out there who use different social media tools like Kakao Talk, like WeChat, like Weibo. So really incorporating different spaces that people use on the internet. Maybe it's a Reddit channel, I don't know, but really think about using social media in a really holistic way to reach all aspects of your community. And earlier, Steve Rubenstein mentioned that people like the puppies and kitties. So I included, so maybe you want to just make census images and then squeeze in a dog, and maybe they'll get their attention. Now you definitely take the census, right? And you'll remember how my dog looks like. So you asked me, oh my God, there's so many things we can do for GOTC. Wendy, what is the magic recipe? And the answer is, there isn't one. Think about when you're baking, I know I have a lot of analogies. But if you're baking, if you have walnuts and chocolate, go and make that nutty goodness. But if you only have flour, butter, and sugar, who's to say a sugar cookie isn't great, right? So really, it's up to you to build out your GOTC plan. It's up to you to decide what type of cookie your community should be having for dessert. And that's it. That's where I leave you.
So I don't know why I get the slide after the cookie, but another way of thinking of it, though, right, is how do you know which is the right cookie recipe? And it's your organization's tactical abilities. Again, if you don't have the abilities to set up a digital access point, then that's not your area of expertise for this. And what are your tactics that'll reach your audience? If your audience is in public housing, maybe door knocking is not the way to go. Your outreach plan is going to be the intersection of the union, of this exciting Venn diagram. So we are all in this together, you and me and the census. I want you all to look at your neighbors and tell them that you're all in it together. Yeah, excellent. Because you know what? When we work in partnerships and collaborations, we get it done. And that's why we're all here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, lastly, before I walk off the stage, I just want to point everyone to the New York Counts has published a GOTC guide. It is a little more operational tips for each of these. It's in the gift bag, by the way, so you will have it. But look out for it, and it will also be available on our website. And lastly, I want to take questions before we walk off the stage. Mita, come back. If we don't have time, that's okay. But I'm an organizer, so I have to leave every speaking engagement with the chant. So when I say New York, you'll say, let's get counted, okay? New York! Let's get counted! New York! Let's get counted! New York! Let's get counted! All right, thank you.
Also, the toolkit it's lovely. The toolkit is great, but if you're more of a bullet point person, we will be posting this slide presentation on the New York Counts 2020 website because we're driving traffic to the website. All right, thank you.